If it's Friday, state of emergency. Cities across America prepare for a potential new surge of migrants as officials eagerly await a court ruling with just days to go before pandemic-era border restrictions are set to expire. And speaking of the pandemic, the triple-demic threat. Is it coming to a holiday gathering near you? We'll speak with a top CDC official about the administration's plan as it prepares for a winter surge in infections. COVID, the flu, RSV, strep throat. And a new Cold War space race is underway, this time between the U.S. and China, as the two superpowers jockey for supremacy in the skies, high above the earth. An inside look at NBC's new documentary, Battlefield Space. That's ahead. Hello there, and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd. We begin today with the immigration crisis in this country, where an already critical situation could soon be getting more dire, as communities hundreds of miles from the southern border are now being forced to take action while Congress remains politically paralyzed. At this hour, we are awaiting a federal court ruling here in Washington to find out if an emergency request from 19 attorneys general to keep the pandemic-era Title 42 border policy from expiring next week, if that is going to happen. Under the banner of coronavirus prevention, Title 42 has been used more than 2 million times to turn migrants, including asylum seekers, away from the border. Action from the district court today could extend the policy by weeks or months. Officials tell NBC News the number of migrants crossing the border, which is already near record highs, may increase by 2,500 a day if Title 42 is lifted. Put that in perspective, we get about 8,000 to 10,000 now, so this would get it well over 10,000 a day. All of this could push communities near and far from the border, some of which are already at the brink due to the current migrant surge, over the edge. Yesterday, Denver, Colorado became the latest city to declare a public emergency, as hundreds of migrants have made their way to the city over the last few weeks, including 247 since Monday. Mayor Michael Hancock says 2 emergency shelters and a reception center have been opened to accommodate the migrants, but the city is on the verge of a breaking point, which is why he made the declaration. I'll be speaking with the mayor in a moment. Whether Title 42 is extended or not, federal action is desperately needed to manage this influx of migrants at the border. But over the past months, years, and decades, our government has clearly not been up to the task. The border is an issue that fires up partisans, and for the most part, those in Washington have preferred to campaign on the issue rather than legislate potential solutions. South Texas Democratic Congressman Vicente Gonzalez placed the blame on both parties when I spoke to him earlier this week.
I'll be clear about this. When Trump was in office, Democrats would go down to my border and point fingers at President Trump. When Biden's in office, I have a slew of Republicans going down there pointing the finger at Biden. And everybody uses the border as a political backdrop, regardless of what side is in power. What we need to do is come together as a country and come up with a proposal that will have a long-term solution to our southern border.
House Republicans, meanwhile, have made the border a pillar of their political strategy, with Speaker hopeful Kevin McCarthy using the issue to rally his troops and obviously find votes for himself to become Speaker. He announced congressional hearings at the border next year after renewing a threat to impeach DHS Secretary Mayorkas. Of course, what McCarthy has not done is put out a plan of any kind of what he would do. That has been missing for years from him and others on the right side of the aisle. The lack of constructive congressional action leaves the onus on the executive branch, in this case the Biden administration. And NBC News has learned that they are considering some changes to the asylum system to mitigate the expected surge, including taking a page from the Trump playbook, which is bound to rankle some in his own party. Look, politics aside, failures by the federal government to manage our asylum system have created humanitarian emergencies all over the country. It's a federal government disaster, folks. And there's a very real chance that an already bad situation could get much worse, with both migrants and local leaders caught in the political crossfire. So let's dive deeper into this issue. Joining me now is our NBC News point person on all things involving the border, Julia Ainsley. So, Julia, we're waiting for this court ruling. We may get it. We assume we're going to get it before 5 p.m. today. It may happen while you and I are talking. Is this one of those cases where the Biden administration is publicly saying one thing but hoping the court rules another way?
Yeah, that's definitely what I hear from immigration advocates and attorneys who first sued to lift Title 42. This is not something that the Biden administration gave up easily. In fact, they did fight to try to win this case, although they say that what they were really fighting for was just the CDC's authority in the future. But if they had dropped this earlier, we could have seen Title 42 lift earlier. And we know that they're scrambling behind the scenes, Chuck. As we've reported here at NBC, they have been talking about new ways to restrict asylum even after Title 42 lifts, so that they don't just have an opening of the floodgates at the border. Although we should point out what this would mean when you end Title 42 is a return to the status quo. Essentially, the border would look like how it did in 2019. But they are worried about what could happen when they lift this. They're worried this could be a magnet for more people to make this journey. And although the numbers have been so high in the past year, most of those people haven't been allowed to stay. So now they'll be taking them in, giving them shelter, and seeing them through the court process, which could take years. So a lot of scrambling behind the scenes. And it could be that the Biden administration today might want these Republican states to win. In fact, there was even a case where they thought they might appeal this decision and try to keep it in place. And in the end, they did agree that they could lift it on December 21st, but they may be hoping that the court today actually grants a long stay for these Republican states and keeps Title 42 in place a little longer. But you have to imagine the clock is going to eventually run out. And some people I've spoken to said, look, now might be the perfect time. You've made it past the midterms. You're not quite into 2024 yet. This might be the time to do it.
Yeah, I don't understand that, actually, but considering that there really is this hose of the cake. But let me ask you this, Joy. Is there anything preventing, we're in the lame duck period of Congress, which means all sorts of stuff can get attached to must-pass bills. Is there any reason why, I mean, instead of sitting here and playing games in the courts, if the administration and a whole bunch of mayors and governors need to buy more time here, any reason why Congress can't just extend Title 42 for 6 months on their own?
Well, you know, Chuck, as well as I do, how hard it is to get anything done on immigration through our Congress. Right now, there is a big debate about what to do about DACA recipients, those immigrants who were brought to the U.S. by their parents when they were children. That's so hard to do because Republicans don't want to touch that. A lot of Republicans don't want to touch that until they say that there's a more secure border. So if they touch Title 42 and even give it an end date, or try to extend it, you could have people in both parties saying that that doesn't go far enough in the direction they want. There's just so much daylight now between these two sides when it comes to anything on the border that the courts are the ones left in charge.
Julia, what's really frustrating here is it's not clear to me what the Biden's plan is to handle the surge. It's not clear to me what McCarthy's idea is to deal with the surge. It's not clear to me what Greg Abbott thinks we can do. I mean, there's a lot of people that want to stop this surge, but nobody is offering up a plan to deal with it, which makes everybody just say, hey, let's just have this temporary, let's keep the hose kinked, essentially. We know if we keep the hose kinked, there's no water that will come out at the end, but they're not actually trying to deal with the spigot.
Yeah, that's a great analogy there, Chuck. But I think that, what they're looking at here are a variety of options. They haven't committed to one yet, and the clock is ticking. If it could be, depending on this court order, we could be looking at Wednesday for lifting Title 42. But one of the ways that they're thinking about doing this is making it so that if a migrant passes through another country on their way to the U.S. and does not first seek asylum there, they'd be ineligible to claim asylum at the U.S. border. And by and large, that's the majority of the people that they're seeing at the border. It's people coming to claim asylum.
Right.
And so this is actually taking a page from Stephen Miller's book. So it's interesting to see how we've come full circle, this administration now looking at things that were on the far right under Trump. But I will say they also want to open more pathways, although there are fewer pathways for people to apply for asylum legally in their countries. That would be through a humanitarian parole program similar to what they've opened up for Ukrainians and Venezuelans.
Julia, correct me if I'm wrong, though. Isn't Canada's asylum policy essentially, you have to apply for asylum in the United States before you get to apply for asylum in Canada?
Canada, funny you should mention, I actually just woke up in Toronto this morning. I've been doing a story on Canadian immigration policy, which you'll see at another time. But it's interesting. Canada... Thank you. Canada is actually much more open when it comes to refugees and immigrants, but they don't have the southern border issue. So right now they've just passed laws to welcome in 500,000 immigrants and economic refugees and economic immigrants each year for the next 3 years. They need 500,000 per year. But look, just in May at our southern border, we saw 240,000 migrants cross. So they're in a really different situation. But yes, they do look to the U.S. as a support in their asylum system. But it's actually much easier, for example, for Afghans to end up sometimes in Canada. The vetting system is different, and it's easier for them to get jobs there.
No, on the refugee front, I knew that. On the asylum, this whole idea of the country you're in first, you need to seek before you go to the next one. Anyway, obviously the big problem here on that front might be Mexico, but we got a lot. That's where this gets very complicated. Anyway, Julia, I'm going to let you go, and I look forward to your Canada report. Excellent. Joining me now is the mayor of Denver, Colorado, Michael Hancock. As I said, he just declared a state of emergency in Denver over the influx of migrants there. Obviously, most people know where Colorado is on a map. Colorado does not its southern border is not another country, and yet these migrants are coming. Mayor, do you have an idea of why your city's been a magnet for this migrant surge?
Chuck, let me first thank you for having me. And we don't know. We do know that, at least in talking with some of the migrants and refugees who've come to Denver over the last couple of weeks, that they came through El Paso, and it was suggested that they come to Denver, not necessarily by the state of Texas, but by NGOs that are on the ground. So,
look, I know you're a city that has some resources to deal with this, but all of this coming at once, I know declaring an emergency helps sort of cut some red tape and allow the state to help, feds to help. But what's realistic here? What can you handle, and what puts you at the breaking point? What becomes the breaking point?
Well, let me just say this, Chuck. If we had not had a partnership with some of our nonprofits and faith leaders and faith institutions on the ground, we would have been at a breaking point. You know, the reality is that since December the 9th, when I opened up the Emergency Operations Center, some 800 migrants and asylum seekers have come to Denver. And that has overwhelmed us. They started at our homeless shelters, overwhelming the system. And then we had to take 3 of our recreation centers offline. And we've had to do that even with our partners helping out by taking 50 here and 100 there to shelter and to provide support services for them. We spent in excess of about $800,000 of general fund money in the city already, providing services, and we don't know when it's going to stop. We continue to see a flow anywhere from 50 to 110. We had 110 people come in last night to 170 people show up in one night. And that just continue to cause us concern that we may have some real crisis on our hand if we don't find a way to, one, release and give myself the power to meet this challenge, but also to begin the process of asking for help, not only here in Denver, but throughout Colorado and around the Rocky Mountain region.
And you also have a homelessness issue that's starting to surge, especially with winter. That puts some strain on shelters. What are you doing to try to deal with that at the same time you've got this migrant surge?
Chuck, it's one reason why we opened up the recreation centers to become, shelters, temporary shelter for the migrants. The reality is that we can't keep them offline too long. People in Denver love their rec centers. They want to access their rec centers as well. We've asked for patience, but the goal was to relieve the pressure that was on our homeless shelters so that we can take care of both populations as best we can during this time. But the clarion call is out. I mean, shortly I'll be on the phone with our federal delegation. Yeah. And I want to commend you for the comments you made as you started this program. The reality is that government has not been up to the task, whether Title 42 is extended or expires. They had the opportunity to address this, but partisan politics have gotten in the way of addressing this very critical issue. And unfortunately, cities like Denver are being forced to do what we have to do to address this challenge while the federal government has fallen down on its responsibility to address this issue.
I can get pretty cynical from my years of covering Washington, but this is so frustrating to hear all this chatter in Washington about the problem, and it's you, a mayor of a city that has to deal with this ridiculousness. If you had Kevin McCarthy and Chuck Schumer in a room, the next head of the House Republicans, I mean, Congress has to do this. What would you tell them?
The reality is that all of us take an oath to serve, to protect the health, safety, and well-being of all of our citizens, and even those who come into our sphere. And the reality is that you have to serve. And right now, one of the most pressing issues facing the American people is the crisis at our border. And though it's a humanitarian effort for people on both sides of the border, do what you have to do to address the issue. Do the job that the people have sent you to Congress to do. We didn't send you there to play partisan politics. We sent you there to take care of the American people and to take care of, quite frankly, our role as a global leader. And right now we're being called. So meet the challenge with the leadership that is being called for at this point in time.
I'm just curious, what does this do to your other services, right? If you're being there, I mean, you know, give me an example of how this impacts other parts of what you're trying to do in the city.
Yeah, great question, Chuck. Every agency in the city of Denver has been brought into the Emergency Operations Center. The moment we activate it, you basically leave your assigned duty or what you've been hired to do in the city of Denver. You go in that Operations Center and you have a new responsibility. So every agency, all hands are on deck. We have city employees who are manning these shelters and who are manning the reception center, who are working around the clock to reunify people with family members and friends who are here in the United States, and to make sure we get the necessary, whatever is necessary to help our migrants who need clothing, food, and shelter.
Right.
And so everybody's focused on that. And then, of course, we have our everyday duties that we have to continue to administer in the city. And I got to give it up to our city employees who are doing everything they can to help us to meet this challenge and also keep the city running. And we are stressing our city employees. We're stressing our agencies. Some of these employees are doing, 14-hour shifts, not only doing the shelter, but sometimes going back to their desk and doing work. But for the most part, we've got folks who've had to abandon their roles and go into the Emergency Operations Center and to do the job of helping us to meet this challenge. So the city has had, similar to what we had to do with the pandemic to meet that challenge, we've had to do it with this challenge that has come to our city.
Before I let you go, if people are watching and they just want to help out, maybe they want to donate some clothes or something, help out an NGO in Denver, is there one or two that you would point out?
Well, I simply would direct people to our website, denvergov.org/OEM. And there you could find where you can volunteer or you can make donations and support the efforts that we have on the ground here in Denver. And thank you for that.
Well, look, I think we all are glad to live in a country that everybody else wants to come to. And I think at that point, that is one thing we ought to remember here and count our blessings about. Anyway, Mayor Hancock, appreciate you coming on and sharing the perspective of what you're dealing with. So thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Happy holidays.
You too. Still ahead, new year, old challenges. Both Democrats and Republicans are starting 2023 facing the same problems they had at the start of 2022. Immigration, the economy, former President Trump's 2024 ambitions. And later, COVID cases and deaths are on the rise again, but vaccination numbers are not. As we head into the holidays, a trio of viruses is hitting people hard all across the country. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We're heading into a new year. We're going to have a new Congress, but it's the same problems. And an even more divided government is coming to Washington in January when Republicans have technical control of the House. But both parties still are grappling with the same identity problems they've had for the last few years, the same issues that need solving or punting, as we just dealt with in the previous segment. Joined now by my panel for this Friday, Brendan Buck, former press secretary to Speakers Paul Ryan, John Boehner, and an NBC News political analyst, Adrienne Elrod, former senior aide to the Biden-Harris campaign, and Eugene Scott, political reporter for the Washington Post. Let me start with immigration because I feel like as reporters, we run in circles. As political analysts, we're running circles. There are 25 solutions sitting on a shelf, and everybody's running away from the politics. I mean, Eugene, when do we hit the breaking point where people finally say, let's just get into a room and solve this problem? Because we're not there yet.
No, we aren't there yet. And, you know, you would think that the midterms would have created some sense of urgency for both parties to get together to find a solution. But I think in part because of how things went, this is not as big of a priority for as many Americans as many people would have feared. But this is certainly something that Democrats and Republicans are going to make a bigger issue as we head into the 2024 election. And so there will be a big need and desire from leaders in both parties to find a solution to take to voters who really do believe that this is an issue affecting them deeply, especially along those states in the southwestern United States that people are going to rely on candidates for votes.
You know, Brendan, it does feel as if the political fear that's out there is among Republicans, right? There are plenty of Republicans who want to solve this problem, but they're afraid of the primary. And we know there's a small vocal minority that isn't minority in a primary that thinks that any compromise on immigration is somehow amnesty, to just throw a word out there. How would you advise a Joe Biden to navigate some sort of immigration reform in a divided Congress, or is that an impossible task?
Yeah, this is the issue in all my time in politics, the one issue where the loud voices control the debate more than any other issue. As you said, polling shows a very clear consensus that there is a compromise to be had, both on increasing the level of immigration, but also stronger border security. I think for Democrats, this issue, though, has become a bit of a blind spot. I think all of us have looked at a lot of polling in the last few months. What you see, one thing that just jumps out to me every single time is how much more Republicans care about immigration than Democrats. Right. You'll see it as a top 3 issue for Republicans, and it barely registers for Democrats. And the problem for Democrats is that independents also look a lot like Republicans on this. They care about this. So this is a really challenging issue for Joe Biden to be walking into. I think they appreciate what they're going to walk into. I don't know that the rest of the party appreciates how many people care about border security. And this story is about to hit the front pages big time next year.
No, it's fascinating. You know, Adrienne, I think Brendan presents a fair point here. You know, Democratic voters, or, you know, those that lean left, immigration is not a top 5 issue. And I would argue, I don't think, and it's why I think so many Democrats are willing to be in different places on immigration, because there isn't a third rail where suddenly you'd get primaried if you go too far in one direction. But at some point, this becomes a general election problem, particularly, you know, in some of these border states. You know, what would be your advice to the administration at how to tackle this?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's be honest. I mean, one of the reasons why this is an issue that matters to Republican voters is because Republicans have used it as a base motivator to get their, you know, voters out in the midterms. We saw this happen time and time again. We certainly saw it happen in the 2022 midterms. So no surprise there. But look, this is something that does have to get solved. And I think both Brendan and Eugene made it very clear that this is something that President Biden and the administration is going to have to take leadership on. I would argue that they have taken leadership positions on this, and they've tried to, get something passed. But I also think that going into 2024, should Biden seek re-election, it is going to be something that, especially some of those independent moderate voters who are going to ultimately decide the election in swing states, who are border states like Arizona, this is going to be a top priority to him. It's a shame that the Senate Tillis bill did not get through, because I think that was something that, and of course that was on Republicans. There were plenty of Democrats to support it. Republicans couldn't get the 60 votes they needed in the Senate, and that's a shame. So I think, again, that's something that Democrats can use to make it clear Republicans are the ones who roadblock this. But ultimately, going into 2023, we do need to find consensus among both sides to get something done.
You know, if that is the case, Eugene, wouldn't it behoove, because where I would quibble with Adrienne there is this idea that the administration has shown its own leadership on this. I mean, I feel like they hide from this issue. You know, Secretary Mayorkas does not go out. He would go out more. I don't think the administration wants him out there. They don't want to put immigration front and center. Eugene, would it be better if the Biden administration called the Republicans' bluff and said, all right, this is all I'm going to focus on for the next month, let's go, and do the power of convening, sort of force Republicans to the table, take it front and center, some hits will come, But I get the impression the Biden White House doesn't ever want to make this issue front and center. But if they did, it might expose Republicans, at least those Republicans that don't really want us to have a solution.
You know, I think that would be a strategy that Biden may have put forward when the White House's priority appeared to be winning back conservative voters and Trump supporters. But we've seen a pivot in the last maybe 6 months where the White House seems to realize that they may not be able to win Republicans and therefore instead should focus on turning out their base. And this is not a priority to Democratic base supporters, as you have noted. And so I think putting full attention on something like immigration could be deemed a distraction for the White House and for the people who support Biden, because the people who may want him to go more right on this issue will not be satisfied with whatever he puts forward because it won't be right enough.
Well, I take your point there. It's one of those things. It's again, it shows you that the base politics dictates the actions sometimes on these issues. Let me pivot a little bit. Brendan, when I have you on, I always want to talk nose counting and Kevin McCarthy. It seems like, is Kevin McCarthy farther away from the speakership than he was last week or closer?
Closer because the calendar is closer. Look, there's a lot of theater that's going to take place from now until then, but there's no real reason to get down to it until you're right then. These folks who are threatening to vote against him are not going to show their cards until the last minute. There's no reality in which here 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the vote, they say, OK, I'm voting for you. So right now, they're just kind of feeling each other out. There's going to have to be a give. It's not surprising to me that they have centered their talks around the motion to vacate, which is the vote that allows you to basically kick the speaker out. That's what they want to have because that's how they think they hold the speaker accountable. I imagine there's going to have to be some negotiation on that, but it probably won't happen until January 1st, January 2nd, maybe on the floor January 3rd, and God forbid it may be January 4th.
So at this point, you have to wait until we get to voting time before the rubber meets the road. Let me talk about the sticky issue that Democrats have to deal with, Adrienne, and that's Kyrsten Sinema. What do you expect the party to do? Supporter, not supporter, challenger? Is this a wait and see?
You know, I think it's a wait and see, and I think a lot of it depends on what happens with Ruben Gallego, who appears to be the front runner if he runs in a Democratic primary. But look, we have to be very careful here. Democrats have to be careful here because Arizona is a state that we need to win in 2024 in order to hold on to the presidency. As you know, Chuck, there's a lot of independent voters in Arizona. So, you know, if she is the presumptive Democrat/independent candidate on the ballot, I think that can help Democrats. But if we have a three-way race between a Republican, independent, and a Democrat, you know, that could be challenging for Democrats. So we have to be very careful with how we walk this. You know, I think a big question, too, is she somebody who is going to be more like an Angus King, or is she somebody who is going to, you know, side more with Republicans? My guess is it's going to be the former than the latter. But I think we've got to watch how these dynamics play out before we make any conclusions on how we, quote unquote, handle, you know, her switch to being an independent.
Well, maybe the real solution is President Biden ought to appoint Kyrsten Sinema his border czar. And we can find out how all that
works. A lot of ambassadorships
Brendan,
out there open as well. That could work, too.
There you go. Brendan, Adrienne, Eugene, appreciate it. I know we're all remote for a reason, but I hope you guys stay safe and healthy over the weekend. Thank you. Still ahead, even as the White House is urging everyone to get their boosters, I'm urging you to do it, too. Congress just approved a massive military bill that will lift the COVID vaccine requirement for U.S. troops. Is that really a good idea for our military readiness? You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The White House will not say for certain if President Biden is actually going to sign a military spending bill that lifts the COVID vaccine mandate for troops, although it seems increasingly likely he's going to have to. This is one of those must-pass bills and usually a must-sign bill because both chambers of Congress passed this bill. And remember, Democrats still control the House and the Senate. and they passed this bill funding the military, and it also lifts the vaccine mandate. Now, this morning, a national security spokesperson at the White House told reporters the president still supports the defense secretary's position that repealing the mandate is not in the best interests of our troops. It comes as the number of COVID cases in the U.S. since the start of the pandemic has just officially topped 100 million. Remember, that doesn't include anybody that tests at home. Not everybody reports their tests in, but it's according to an NBC News tally. And we now know there's been more than 1 million deaths. Meanwhile, the White House has just announced new steps to try to combat a winter surge in COVID cases, offering more free at-home tests and preparing supplies that can be sent to states seeing a surge. Of course, the rise in COVID cases is also happening alongside a rise in flu and respiratory infections across the country, just in time for the holiday travel season. So joining me now is Dr. Barbara Mann, physician and epidemiologist with the CDC, who's been working on the agency's response to the pandemic. All right. We're doing this remote because I'm one of the 100 million plus cases as we speak here. So what is would you still classify us as in a pandemic, or is this now an endemic?
Hi, Chuck, and I'm glad to be here with you. Thank you so much. What I think we can say is that we're in a different phase of COVID-19. It's still a really important public health problem. As you've said, cases are going up. We're still seeing hundreds of deaths a day, thousands of hospitalizations a day, and it really needs to be taken seriously as a public health problem, and people need to do what they can to protect themselves, which is most importantly, to get vaccinated, to get the updated bivalent booster.
And the importance of the vaccine, right? It doesn't mean it's going to prevent you from getting COVID. And I know you know this and I know this, but I feel like we should reiterate it. The point of getting the vaccine is what, Dr. Mann?
Well, the vaccines are really good at protecting against severe illness, hospitalization, death. They're not as good at protecting against just getting infected. But what we really care about is whether we get, meaningfully ill, hospitalized, have to go to the emergency department, and they protect really well against that. In fact, we just had 2 new scientific studies that just came out today showing that the people who got the updated bivalent booster have only half of the hospitalization, the risk of being hospitalized, or the risk of needing to go to the emergency department for COVID. So that's really meaningful protection, and people who haven't gotten this booster should get it as soon as they can.
Now, I want to talk about RSV because a lot of parents are concerned about this. In fact, in a Kaiser poll, more parents are worried about their children getting RSV than they are the flu or COVID. Are their fears correct that they should be more worried about their kids getting RSV?
Yeah, RSV is it's been around for a long time. This is not a new virus. It is the most common cause of hospitalization in kids. And so, yeah, especially for little kids, it does make sense to be, concerned about them getting it. For most kids, it isn't a serious illness, but for a significant number of children, maybe 1 or a couple percent of children every year do get hospitalized for it. Almost all kids will get it by the time they're 2 years old. And what parents can do to protect their children is really just those everyday actions that you take to keep yourself safe, covering your cough, washing hands, staying home when sick, staying away from other people who are sick. Also, people have the option to wear a mask if they would like to, and we do recommend that. Not so much for RSV, but where COVID levels are high, we do recommend wearing a mask.
You know what? Let me ask you that basic. So a lot of people are going to be traveling. A lot of people are going to be going to big gatherings. Tell me how you walk around. Tell me when you wear a mask, when you don't, when you do. I think people want to know, what does a doctor do? What does a pediatrician do? What would you be doing?
Yeah, and I am a pediatrician, and I also have a 91-year-old father-in-law who sometimes lives with me. So I try to be careful, and I try to make good decisions. If I'm going to be in a large crowd, if I'm traveling, I will think about wearing a mask. When my father-in-law is staying with me, I'm much more likely to wear a mask if I go out into a crowded place than if he's not. I also, I can't emphasize the vaccines enough. I think that, I think people are really tired of hearing that you should get vaccinated, but this one is, right. It's really very effective, and I just, can't recommend it enough.
Why do you guys have a theory as to why, even though COVID cases are up, hospitalizations are up, deaths are up, that vaccinations for COVID are not?
Well, I think that people have pandemic fatigue and they have vaccine fatigue. And I understand that. I have pandemic fatigue and vaccine fatigue too. But knowing how effective these vaccines are, I think that, it seems like really clearly a good idea to get it, especially as you say, as we're heading into the winter season when, for the last 2 years, we've had really tough COVID winters. And that's also the time when the other respiratory viruses tend to go up as well. So, I get why people are tired of having to think about it, but unfortunately, COVID isn't going away. And we do need to do what we can do to keep ourselves safe and to keep our loved ones safe.
Dr. Barberman, who's been working with the CDC on all of this, really appreciate you coming on and sharing your expertise with us. Thank you. Enjoy the holidays.
Thank
Still
you.
Ahead. What we're learning from the newly declassified files related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And while thousands of documents are still being kept secret, what is the CIA afraid of us knowing? But first, a dive into the Meet the Press archives. Click on this QR code to explore 75 years of history-making interviews, including this exchange with then Senator John F. Kennedy.
Senator Prime Minister Macmillan yesterday endorsed the idea of a summit conference to be held next spring. And therefore, we have the Russians demanding one, and the British seem leaning toward one. Now, if you're the man who would have to attend the summit conference, what would be your views on it?
Well, I'm hopeful. In fact, I feel it would be essential, Ms. Chancellor, that there should be negotiation at the secondary level on these matters which divide us. Berlin, disarmament, cessation of nuclear tests, control of outer space, disarmament of outer space. I would feel that foreign ministers and at the ambassadorial level there should be conferences which would indicate that we were going to accomplish something.
Welcome back. The National Archives released thousands of documents yesterday related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Some of the documents are documents they released before, but this time with fewer redactions. So historians are now combing through the over 13,000 documents, looking for any new information, including more details relating to Lee Harvey Oswald's trip to Mexico City weeks before JFK's assassination. But despite the release of this tranche of documents, it falls short of a 1992 law that required all documents be made public to the public, available by October of 2017. In 2017, then President Trump authorized the release of some documents, but he was convinced to hold back others, citing national security concerns. And last year, President Biden postponed the release of any documents, citing the pandemic, which is why we just got this release now. According to the National Archives, 97% of all documents related to JFK's assassination have been released, and the remaining 3% are either fully or partially redacted. In a memo from the president, the National Archives have until May of next year to review the remaining redactions, with the next batch of documents scheduled to be released by June of next year. So joining me now to break this down is Jeff Morley. He is simply the best JFK expert there is. He's vice president of the Mary Farrell Foundation. So Jeff, it seems as if we're sort of in the same place we were last year when we talked about this, which is the CIA is clearly afraid of something going public about their actions in Latin America, Cuba, or what they knew about Oswald. And it looks as if we're not getting any answers from this tranche of documents.
That is unfortunately what has happened. For the fourth time in 5 years, the CIA has blown the deadline for full disclosure that's written into the law. So the only thing you conclude is that if you're hiding something for so long in defiance of the law, you have something to hide. And, the question these documents raise is, what is that thing? First of all, this release is a bit of a shell game. Yes, some documents were released in full. We went through last night and checked about 35 documents. that supposedly released in full. In fact, only 13 of them were released in full, and 20 others still contain virtually the same redactions that they included last week. They might have declassified a sentence or two. So there's a bit of a shell game going on here, and which sort of doubles the importance of the question. So what are they hiding?
Look, there's a lot of theories. It seems like one of the explanations could be there's some actions they took in the 50s in Latin America, in Cuba, in dealing with Oswald that are going to be pretty embarrassing. And perhaps a sitting president would have to apologize on behalf of the American government, which is why every one of these sitting presidents, when they're faced with the release deadline, end up sort of exactly because it's easier. Is that the most likely explanation here?
That is what's going on. The question is, are they hiding, incompetence, or are they hiding actual, complicity or malfeasance in the case of the assassination of the president? And, when you don't have all the records and somebody keeps, violating a clear agreement by Congress that all of this material should be made public, people are going to think the worst. And clearly the CIA doesn't care about those consequences of encouraging people to believe in conspiracy theories, because they can always say, look, the government's still hiding something. It's unfortunate that neither Trump nor Biden put their foot down and ended, this charade. And now they're going to kick the can down the road and, hope that this thing goes away. But, look at the attention it gets every November 22nd. Look at the attention this order gets. It's not going to go away. The CIA wants the problem to go away, but it's a problem of their own making, and the only way to solve it is to have full disclosure now.
Look, at some point I hope to interview the current head of the CIA. He seems like a guy that believes in transparency really more than any other CIA. He at least has preached it more than previous heads of the CIA. This really does feel as if, are we, at this point, do we have to wait until our grandchildren are adults and they'll get the full release?
I don't think that we should settle for that. At a time when democratic institutions are under assault and being questioned and delegitimized, this is the time to show people that government does work and that the government can take a hit. If something wrong, criminal happened related to President Kennedy's assassination 60 years ago, the American people are grown up. I think they can handle it. Yes, the CIA might be mightily embarrassed. You know what? Somebody might lose their job. That doesn't need to be an important consideration in this. Congress was very explicit when they passed this law. All of this stuff should be public by 2017. So, 5 years after the deadline, it's time to enforce the law and end the nonsense.
Would you like to see more members of the Kennedy family be out front asking for this release? Do you think that would help?
It would. I understand that it's a very painful subject for them, that it draws them into conversations they don't want to be involved in. I think it's incumbent on Congress to take the lead here. The courts can't really force the executive branch to do anything, not a lot. But Congress could step in here and have oversight hearings and say, let's get to the bottom of this. If you have concerns, there's something you really have to hide, in 5 or 10 cases, okay, but not thousands of documents, which is still the situation we're in today. There's 3,000-4,000 CIA documents about the assassination that still contain redactions, that we're not going to see for a while.
Right. But Jeff, it's 97%. They've released 97%. I'm kidding. I just find that to be, it's always the 3%.
Yeah, no, and that's the shell game. That's all the government records. That's not the CIA records. The CIA only released about 2/3 of the documents that had redactions yesterday. So, they're playing games with this subject, and that encourages people to be suspicious. It's too bad.
No, you're right. You're right. It only increases conspiratorial thinking at a time when we should be demystifying how things work. Jeff Morley, always a pleasure to have you on. Keep digging, my friend. Keep digging.
Thank you, Chuck.
Up next, battlefield space, China's new challenge to U.S. dominance above the atmosphere and how it could impact national security right here on Earth. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. From the first civilian space flights to NASA's plans to go back to the moon and even to Mars, we're at the dawn of a new era of space innovation and exploration. For space junkies, it's pretty exciting. But all these advances have also reignited some old tensions and introduced new players, launching a modern space race between the United States, Russia, but actually more importantly, now China. China has emerged as a leader in space innovation, operating their own space station and outpacing the U.S. in satellite launches, actually. Now U.S. military generals warn that both China and Russia are growing their offensive, destructive capabilities in space, blowing up some of their own satellites as tests. My colleague Tom Costello explores the next stage of the space race in a new NBC News Now documentary, Battlefield Space to the Moon and Beyond. Here's an excerpt.
3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
Roaring off Launch Pad 39B at the Kennedy Space Center, the next chapter in America's love affair with all things space.
All 4 RS-25 engines on the core stage and 2 solid rocket boosters now propelling the vehicle at 128 miles per hour.
A lot's changed since July 1969 when this mission control room put Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. Back then, it was all about human exploration, innovation, technology, learning what's beyond the Earth. 50-plus years later, it is now also about a strategic and national security imperative.
We're in the middle of one of the most fundamental changes in the character of war in the history of mankind.
And talk of war extends into space. The space race is no longer a race between just the U.S. and Russia. China has leapfrogged Russia, launching more rockets than the U.S. in 2022. Completing its own orbiting space station, landing robotic missions on the far side of the moon.
I think American pride, if China gets there before us, even for a second time, I think that might bruise us a little. And maybe we'll redouble and say, okay, you take the moon, we're going to Mars. If that redoubles that, by the way, that would be a geopolitical decision. Sure, go for it.
And Tom Costello joins me now. You know, Tom, the Space Force became a branch of the military, and it was something a lot of people were concerned about. And one of the reasons is figuring out how are we going to satellite security, right? That seems to be like that's step one here in figuring out how to protect ourselves in space. How prepared are we for that?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I mean, the military believes that China will, in fact, possibly eclipse the United States in space by 2045, if not sooner. We want to have people on the moon in 25. They want to have people on the moon in 2030. They've already got a robotic base on the moon. They are also talking about a military posture in space. They've already blown up satellites to demonstrate offensive capability. So have the Russians. Right. We have not done that since 1985. We did it at low Earth orbit, so all those pieces disintegrated. They did it way up high, and those pieces continue to orbit the Earth. So the U.S. commanders in Space Force and Space Comm at the Pentagon, they believe this is a serious national security imperative and a threat. Yeah. And they think that we need to be on our game and forward-leaning.
Is there going to be a land grab on the moon?
Well, that depends on who you ask. I mean, the administrator of NASA believes that that's what China wants to do. And he has said China wants to control the moon. China has said, no, absolutely not. We don't want to control the moon. But it is true, just like in any battlefield, whoever controls the high ground, whether that's the moon or the space between the moon and Earth, an area called cislunar, if you control that space, then you make people pay a toll to get to the moon, for example. You can understand why that's very valuable real estate, and that's the concern that U.S. commanders have as we go forward here, and that's why they want to be forward-leaning.
Was any of this contemplated when the initial space treaty? There's this treaty that was signed in '67. Over 100 nations have signed on to this space treaty. Was sort of keeping the moon neutral even thought of then? And is this something that we have to address? Yeah.
That was the goal. Now, you know, we have a fascinating conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson throughout this documentary, if you get a chance to watch it. And we talk about that.
I will.
And he says, well, wasn't that sweet? We all agreed that we were not going to fight on the moon. And yet, if you look at our pattern of behavior on Earth, that seems unlikely.
Yeah, I tell you, some of this stuff would have seemed crazy that you and I were having this conversation 10 years ago. It feels very real these days. Tom, this is a terrific piece. I'm so glad you put it together. Congrats on it.
Thank you, sir.
Battlefield Space is available to stream right now on NBC News Now, Peacock, YouTube, and the NBC News Now original content will keep on coming. That I promise you. Tonight at 10:30 Eastern, don't miss a News Now special, Boiling Point, the city's fight for clean water. It is a deep dive into the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis and the social and political toll it's taking on that city. And if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC News station. I'll have exclusive interviews with Senator Sherrod Brown, Governor Asa Hutchinson, and the brand new mayor of America's second largest city, L.A. Mayor Karen Bass.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.